Scenes and Adventures in the Semi-Alpine region of the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and Arkansas, 1853, by Rowe, Schoolcraft. Chapter 4, Part 2, Number 11. November 13th. The threatening appearance of the atmosphere induced us to remain most of the day in our rock house, which was devoted to devising a more safe and compact mode of carrying specimens, to repairs of our pack saddles, a reconstruction of the mode of packing, etc. We then made a further reconnaissance of the cavern and its vicinity and productions. I had paid particular attention to the subject of the occurrence of animal bones in our western caves, as those of Europe had recently excited attention, but never found any in a single instance, except the species of existing weasels and other very small quadrupeds, which are to be traced about these castellated and cavernous cliffs. As evening approached, a flock of turkeys, coming in from the plain to the top of the cliff above the cavern, flew down onto the trees directly in front of us, sheltered as we were from their sight, and afforded a fine opportunity for the exercise of our sportsmanship. November 14th. The rain which had threatened to fall yesterday poured down this morning, and continued with more or less violence all day. Our packages, clothing, arms, and accoutrements were thoroughly overhauled and examined. We had still supplies of everything essential to our comfort. Our bacon had not been seriously trenched on, while the forest had amply supplied us with venison, and our groceries bade fair to last us till we should strike some of the main southern streams, or till our increasing powers of endurance and forest skill should enable us to do without them. This morning, November 15th, the sky being clear and bright, we left our rock abode in the Wall Cave Valley. We ascended this valley a short distance, but as it led us too far west, and the brush proved so thick as to retard our progress, we soon left it. With some ado, the horse was led to the top of the cliff. A number of lateral valleys, covered with thick brush, made this a labor by no means light. The surface of the ground was rough, vegetation sere and dry, and every thicket which spread before us presented an obstacle which was to be overcome. We could have penetrated many of these, which the horse could not be forced through. Such parts of our clothing as did not consist of buckskin paid frequent tribute to these brambles. At length we got clear of these spurs and entered on a high tableland, where traveling became comparatively easy. The first view of this vista of highland plains was magnificent. It was covered with moderate-sized sere grass and dry seed pods, which rustled as we passed. There was scarcely an object deserving the name of a tree, except now and then a solitary trunk of a dead pine or oak, which had been scathed by the lightning. The bleached bones of an elk, a deer, or a bison were sometimes met. Occasionally we passed a copse of oak or cluster of saplings. The deer often bounded before us, and we sometimes disturbed the hare from a sheltering bush, or put to flight the quail and the prairie hen. There was no prominent feature in the distance for the eye to rest on. The unvaried prospect at length produced satiety. We felt in a peculiar manner the solitariness of the wilderness. We traveled silently and diligently. It was a dry and wave-like prairie. From morning till sunset, we did not encounter a drop of water. This became the absorbing object. Hill after hill and vale after vale were patiently ascended and diligently footed without bringing the expected boon. At last we came, suddenly and unexpectedly, to a small running stream in the plain, where we gladly encamped. I quickly struck up a cheerful fire, and we soon had a cup of tea with our evening's repast. Nor was butcher neglected. There was a patch of short green grass on the margin of the brook, to which he did ample justice. we were not long after supper and yielded ourselves to a sound sleep. While we were in the act of encamping, I had placed my powder flask on the ground, and on lighting the fire neglected to remove it. As the plain was covered with dry leaves, they soon took fire and burned over a considerable space, including the spot occupied by myself and the flask. The latter was a brass-mounted shooting flask of translucent horn, having a flaw through which grains of powder sometimes escaped. Yet no explosion took place. I looked and beheld the flask which the fire had thus run over very near me with amazement. November 16th. We were now on an elevated summit of tableland, or watershed, which threw its waters off alternately to the Missouri and Mississippi. It was covered with high, coarse prairie grass, and its occasional monodon clusters of prairie flowers run to seed. In depressed places, the greenbrier occasionally became entangled with the horse's feet and required time to extricate him. We were very frequently past the head and thigh bones of the buffalo, proving that the animal had been freely hunted on these plains. In the course of about 8 miles' travel, we passed 2 small streams running to the northwest, which led us to think that we were diverging too far towards the Missouri side of this vast highland plateau. It was still some hours of sunset, and we had gone about 4 miles farther when we reached a large, broad stream, also flowing towards the northwest. It had a rapid and deep current, on each side of which was a wide space of shallow water and boulders of limestone and sandstone. It required some skill to cross this river, as it was too deep to ford. The horse was led into the edge of the stream and driven over, coming out with his pack safely on the other side. The shallow parts offered no obstacle, and we bridged the deeper portions of the channel with limbs and trunks of trees, which had been brought down by the stream when in flood and left upon its banks, and being denuded of their bark were light and dry and as white as bleached bones. I had crossed the channel safely after my companion, but he disturbed the bridge on stepping from it and caused me to slip from the stick. Having my gun in my right hand, I naturally extended it to break my fall. Each end of it, as it reached the stream, rested on a stone, and my whole weight being in the center, the barrel was slightly sprung. This bridge, for the purpose of reference, I called Calamarca. After crossing the stream, we came to a stand, and on consultation explored it downward to determine its general course, but finding it too inclined toward the northwest, we returned up its southern bank 2 or 3 miles above our rustic bridge and encamped. November 17th. In the morning, we proceeded in a south-southwesterly direction, which, after keeping up the valley from the camp of Calamarca for a few miles, carried us up an elevated range of hills covered with large oaks bearing acorns. We had reached the top of a ridge which commanded a view of a valley beyond it, when we observed, far below us in the valley, 4 bears on an oak, eating sweet acorns. The descent was steep and rough, with loose stones, which made it impossible to lead the horse down without disturbing them. We therefore tied him to a saddle, and after looking to our priming, we began to descend the height. But as the leaves had all fallen, concealment was impossible, and when the animals became alarmed and began to come down the tree, we ran at our utmost speed to reach its foot first. In this effort, my companion fell on the loose stones and sprained his ankle. I kept on, but did not reach the foot of the tree in time to prevent their escape, and I followed them some distance. When my companion's absence led me back to him, I found him badly hurt. He limped along with the utmost difficulty. I soon mounted him on the pack horse and led up the little valley, but the pain of his ankle became so intense that he could not bear the motion, and after proceeding a mile or 2, we determined to halt and encamp. We had not traveled from our morning's encampment more than 5 or 6 miles. I accordingly unpacked the horse, prepared a pallet for my companion, and built a fire. I then bathed his ankle with salt and warm water. This done, I took my gun and sauntered along the thickets in the hope of starting some game. Nothing, however, was found. The shrill and unmusical cry of the blue jay, which was the largest bird I saw, reminded me of other latitudes. Thoughtful and full of apprehension at this untoward accident, I returned to our little camp and diligently renewed my antalgic applications. November 18th. A night's rest and the little remedies in my power to employ had so far abated the pain of my companion's ankle that he again consented to mount the pack-horse, and we pursued our way up the little valley in which we had encamped. We had not, however, traveled far when we saw two large black bears playing in the grass before us, and so intently engaged in their sport that they did not observe us. My companion, with my aid, quickly dismounted. We examined our arms, tied the horse, and, having determined to fire together, had reached our several stations before the animals noticed our approach. They at first ran a few yards, but then turned and sat up in the high, sere grass to see what had disturbed them. We fired at the same moment, each having singled out his mark. Both animals fled, but on reaching the spot where the one I fired at had sat, blood was copiously found on the grass. I pursued him and his mate over an adjoining ridge, where I lost sight of them, but discovering on crossing the ridge a hollow oak, into which I judged they had crept, I went back for the axe to fell it. While engaged at this, my companion hobbled up and relieved me at the axe. The tree at length came down with a thundering crash, partially splitting in its fall, and I stood ready with my gun to receive the discomfited inmates. But after gazing intently for a time, none appeared. It was now evident they had eluded us, and that we had lost the track. The excitement had almost cured my companion's lameness, but it returned when the pursuit was over, and resuming his position on the horse, we proceeded over a succession of high, oak-covered ridges. In crossing one of these, a large and stately elk offered another object for our notice. He had an enormous pair of horns, which it seemed he must find it difficult to balance in browsing. But the moment he became aware of our propinquity, he lifted his head and, throwing back the antlers, they seemed to form shields for his shoulders and sides, while plunging forward through the thickets. We stood a moment to admire his splendid leaps. These incidents had carried us a few miles out of our course. We were on high, broken summits, which resembled in their surface what may be conceived of the tossing waves of a sea suddenly congealed. On descending from these towards the south, we came to clumps of bushes with gravelly areas between, and an occasional standing pool of pure water. It was very evident to our minds as we advanced that these pools must communicate with each other through the gravel, and that there were seasons when there was more water washed from the hills. On following down this formation about 6 miles, the connection became more evident, and the sources of an important river developed themselves. We were, in fact, on the extreme headwaters of the great North Fork of White River, the Unica of the Cherokees, and the Riviera Blanche of the French. The manner in which the waters developed themselves on descending the southern slope of these highlands is remarkable. They proceed in plateau or steps, on each of which the stream deploys in a kind of lake or elongated basin, connected with the next succeeding one by a narrow rapid. The rock is a gray sandstone in the lower situations, capped with limestone. In some places the water wholly disappears and seems to permeate the rock. We came to a place where the river, being some 4 feet deep, is entirely absorbed by the rock and does not again appear till a mile below, where it suddenly issues from the rock in its original volume.